This is North on Intervale, a series that explores culturally relevant topics and ideas and the impacts that they have on the students in our community today. My name is Benjamin North, and today we'll be discussing politics, representation in politics, and the connection between politics and advocacy. I am joined today by Mariella Johnson. Mariella is a scholar going into the 8th grade who has a passion for fashion and design. She is also a member of the UNO Club at Faros Academy, a club that examines bullying at the middle school level. Mariella, thank you for being here.
Pleasure.
I am also really excited to introduce our guest today, Congressman Richie Torres. Congressman Torres, at the age of 25, became New York's youngest elected official in the New York City Council. He is the first openly LGBTQ person elected to office in the Bronx and the first Afro-Latino elected to Congress. He represents New York's 15th Congressional District in the South Bronx. Congressman Torres, thank you for being here.
Hello everyone, I'm Congressman-elect Richie Torres from the Boogie Down Bronx. I never thought in my wildest dreams, as a poor kid of color, that I would go from public housing in the Bronx to the People's House in Washington, D.C. I am fired up and I'm looking forward to causing good trouble.
To get things started, we want to talk a little bit about your personal story and get to know you a little bit. Mariella, the floor is yours.
Hi, Congressman Torres. And my first question is, tell me what your experience like growing up in the South Bronx.
Well, first, it's an honor to be here with you, and I'm so impressed with everything you've accomplished. Thank you for allowing me the opportunity to tell my story. You know, I'm a son of the Bronx. I was born, bred, and battle-tested in the Bronx. I spent most of my life in poverty. Nothing was handed to me on a silver platter. I've had to fight for everything that I have in my life. The most important figure in my life has been my mother, who raised 3 children on minimum wage, which in the 1990s was a mere $4.25 an hour. And when I won my primary in June of 2020, I publicly said that I would not be here were it not for my mother. That this moment belongs as much to her as it does to me. The most formative experience of my childhood was growing up in public housing, which has been so neglected and underfunded by the federal government, that I grew up in conditions of mold, and mildew, leaks, and lead, without reliable heat and hot water in the winter. And I actually grew up in a public housing development right across the street from Trump Golf Course. And as I saw the conditions in my own home get worse every day, the government had invested more than $100 million in a golf course development. And I remember wondering to myself at the time, what does it say about our society that we're willing to invest more in a golf course than in the homes of struggling New Yorkers, especially struggling New Yorkers of color? And so that experience of inequality in the shadow of Trump Golf Course is what inspired me to get my start as a housing organizer. And then at age 24, I took the leap of faith and I ran for public office. I had no deep pockets, I had no ties to the party machine, but I was a housing organizer. I was young and energetic, and I spent a whole year knocking on doors. I went into people's homes, I heard their stories. And I won my first campaign on the strength of door-to-door, face-to-face grassroots campaign. I became the first openly gay elected official from the Bronx. And that began a journey that ultimately led me from the New York City Council to the United States Congress.
Wow. Thank you for sharing your story. And my next question is, when did you realize you wanted to be a politician?
You know, I knew that I was on a mission to make a difference. And I was on a mission to advocate for people in public housing, people who had to face the same challenges that I had to face growing up. And I came to realize over time that one of the best vehicles for affecting change in the world is public service, is politics. You know, I'm deeply informed by the words of Mahatma Gandhi, who said, "Become the change that you wish to see in the world." And I said to myself, rather than stand by idly on the sidelines and complain, why not become the change I wish to see in the world? And I live by a simple motto: if we do nothing, nothing will change. We all have to do something. And nowhere can you have a greater impact in improving people's lives than in government, because government affects every aspect of it. And so I in 2014, when I became a member of the city council, I became the chair of the public housing committee. And I came to discover there were a number of public housing developments that had been devastated, physically damaged by Superstorm Sandy. And so I held a public housing hearing in one of those developments. And I enabled residents to tell their stories. And that hearing put pressure on FEMA to invest $3 billion in rebuilding public housing developments that had been damaged by Superstorm Sandy. So my mission as a public official has been to raise the voices of those who historically have gone unheard and overlooked.
Congressman Torres, I'm really struck by what you had to say about your mom, like raising you on such a low salary. Marielle and I talked about how the bell would go off in the school as we were having this conversation. No, it really strikes me. And I remember when I first started teaching in the Bronx, I didn't know about the stories from the previous generations in like the 70s and in the 80s. And thankfully now I do. And Mariella and I had a conversation about the fires of the 70s and things like that. And, you know, you've said in the past about how resilient you are and how resilient the people of the Bronx are. And like that has been really, you know, I see a really, really courageous group of people, and I see you being really courageous with your story and how that's passed on from, you know, generation to generation. I want to ask you a little bit, a deeply personal question about courage and how it, you know, it takes a lot of courage to come out and express one's authentic self. You know, what has the process of coming out taught you about openness and sharing your story?
For me, there's nothing more important in life than integrity, and to be honest with yourself and honest with the world in which you live. And, you know, I first acknowledged my sexuality when I was 16. I had come across a profile of a teacher of mine on MySpace, back when MySpace was fashionable and dating myself. This was before Facebook. and it was the first time that I knew that someone in my world was openly LGBTQ. And so I approached him, and at that moment I spontaneously came out. It was the first time I had acknowledged my sexuality to someone else. And that began a 8-year process of coming to terms with my sexual identity. And the process culminated in my first campaign for the city council. When I ran for the city council, I said to myself that I'm going to be honest about who I am, right? Because if I'm dishonest about something as personal and as important as my identity, then it means that I can be dishonest about anything else. And so I thought it was important as a matter of integrity for me to tell voters I am an openly gay candidate. My sexuality is not the totality of who I am, but it's an important part of who I am. And I'm not going to hide it. I'm not going to lie about it. I'm going to be open and honest with you about every aspect of my life. And I feel like the process of coming out and the integrity that it demands from you teaches you an ethic of what I call radical authenticity. And it's an ethic that not only leads you to be honest about your sexuality, it leads you to be honest about every aspect of your life. You know, I have been open about my struggles with depression. Mm-hmm. I have every day, I take an antidepressant to help me cope with my lifelong struggle with depression. And I feel no shame in admitting it. And I tell my story in the hopes of inspiring others to overcome the struggles in their lives and to imagine themselves in positions of power in government. So I consider the process of coming out, the product of coming out, to be a lifelong gift.
I really appreciate what you have to say about like your depression, because that's something that, you know, it doesn't subscribe to a particular identity, right? That's something that impacts all of us. And, you know,
it's universal.
Yeah, it's a universal issue.
I'm a person of many identities, but not everyone is Black.
Right.
Not everyone is Latino. Not everyone is gay. Not everyone is millennial. But all of us have mental health. All of us have either had struggles with mental illness or know someone in our lives who have had those struggles.
Totally.
So there's nothing more universal than the experience of mental health.
Torres, Mariela, I want your thoughts here. Can you, well, when you hear Congressman Torres talking about the importance of identity, the importance of being honest and sharing his story, how does that make you feel?
It makes me feel that I should always still stay true to myself, because if you put the truth out there, it's better than keep on doing lie after lie after lie. So even though you may think it's going to be difficult at first, you should always keep on putting it out there to at least know, like, hey, it's out there, so whether what anybody wants to do with it, it's okay.
Yeah. And when you think about the word identity, Mariela, what does that word mean to you?
It means to me not just what others perceive about you or what's shown on the outside, but it's what you feel on the inside and what really matters to you.
Mariela, that's amazing. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. I want to keep things moving. I want to talk about what is politics and why is it important. And Mariela has the first question in this part.
Now that I've gotten to know you more, I want to ask you about politics and politicians. First of all, why is it important for students to know about politics and politicians?
You should know about politics because it affects your life. The central institution in our society is government. Government sets the rules that governs our lives, that affects our lives. And so we all have a vested interest in knowing who is representing us in government and what rules and laws those people are passing and how does it affect our lives. And we live in a democratic society, in a government that's supposed to represent us. And part of your responsibility, you have a right to vote, but you also have an obligation to vote. Because voting is the mechanism by which you hold your elected officials accountable. Right? If you're an employer and I'm an employee, and I'm performing poorly, you have the option of firing me, you have the option of demoting me, you have the option of holding me accountable. And that's our relationship between citizen and elected official. Is if I'm failing as an elected official, you can hold me accountable by voting me out of office. And that's why it's so critical for people to be participants in their democracy. For me, true democracy exists not when people can vote, but when people actually do vote. When you fail to vote, you are disenfranchising and disempowering yourself. And you're doing a disservice to your community, because if you do not care enough about your community to vote, then no one else will.
Thank you for sharing that, Congressman. I want to get into some of the specifics about what you do. And I know you touched on this on the beginning, but you've been up to quite a lot in the short amount of time that you've been in office already. I'd like to hear about your role with some different things like the Equality Act and what your role was like with the Equality Act. What did you do?
So I'm part of the Democratic Caucus, which is the majority party in the House of Representatives. And we passed the Equality Act, which would expand the scope of the Civil Rights Act to protect the LGBTQ community. The Equality Act is based on a simple idea, that no one should be fired or evicted or denied critical services or accommodations simply because of who you are or whom you love. We are all equal under the eyes of the law, regardless of our sexuality or gender identity. And so that's the legislation that we passed in the House. It has not yet been passed in the Senate because of the filibuster. See, in the House, we can pass bills by a simple majority. In the Senate, because of a process known as the filibuster, it takes at least 60 votes to pass most legislation, like the Equality Act. And there's majority support for the Equality Act in the Senate, but we're below the 60 threshold for passing it.
Thank you for sharing. Hopefully it moves forward. Mariela, the next question, I want to ask you a question, actually, something we've been talking about, Congressman Torres, is representation in government. And Mariela, I want to ask you, and Congressman Torres, feel free to add on after she finishes. It's okay if you don't. We'll keep moving on. But Mariela, why is it why did you think it's important for communities like the Bronx to have a congressman to represent them?
I think it's important for Congressman to represent because, like Congressman Torres, he comes from the Bronx. So he knows all the situations and problems that may be occurring, and he can be that voice to tell them that all the problems. Congressman Torres, what would you say to a student who wants to be a politician?
Well, make the most of your education, because if you are an educated person, if you know how to think, and if you know how to write, and if you know how to speak, then there's no one who can stop you in the world. There's no limit to how far you can go in your life. The power to communicate is the most important skill that you can possess in politics. So work hard, study, make the most of your education, self-improvement, preparation, because you cannot control the cards that you're dealt in life. You cannot control what opportunities come to you in life. There are forces beyond your control. What you can control is whether you're prepared to make the most of an opportunity when it arises. And the best form of preparation is education. So make the most of your schooling, which I can tell that you're doing by virtue of your questions.
Thanks.
Mariella does more than just make sure that she takes full advantage of her education. Like, I promise you, like, when we're in the classroom, Mariella does not hesitate to help everyone at her table. Like,
but when you asked her definition of identity, she gave a much better answer than most people would give.
Yeah.
Who are much older.
Thank you.
It was very impressive.
Yeah, and I want to shout out your whole class, Mariella, because Mariella, you are representative of the students that enter in your classroom. There is a lot, and Congressman Torres, I promise you, there is a lot of really, really brilliant scholars that are in the same grade as Mariella. And when I first got to the school and I was like, I'm going to teach these kids math, I felt like I was learning math along with them. Like they were on point. So I can't tell you how impressed I am. I would like to go into sort of our final category for today, which is representation and social justice. And Mariella, once again, the floor is all you.
This is another question for you, Congressman. Why do you think it's important for marginalized groups to be represented in government?
Because our greatest strength is diversity. And we need and deserve a government that is every bit as diverse as America itself. You know, I'm proud to belong to the House Democratic Caucus. 70% of the Democratic Caucus consists of women, people of color, and members of the LGBTQ community. So I belong to a caucus that reflects the mosaic of America as a multiracial democracy. And it's important for people to see themselves in government, to see their lived experiences and their struggles represented in public policy. You know, when you feel like your government has nothing in common with you, you will feel alienated, you will feel less represented. So in order for government to be truly representative, it has to be representative of our diversity not only of identity, but lived experience. So that's why it's so important. And, you know, one of my favorite quotes is, if you don't have a seat at the table, then you're probably on the menu. And communities like ours deserve a seat at the table, including one of the most powerful tables, the United States Congress.
Wow, that's a very striking quote. Thank you. Mariella, when you hear Congressman Torres talk about the representation of marginalized groups, how does that make you feel?
It makes me feel grateful to have someone like Congressman Torres to represent those groups, because they might feel incapable of doing it themselves. So for him to be the voice is a good thing.
Thank you for sharing that, Mariella. Congressman Torres, I have sort of one big question for you before we start to conclude our interview. It's a very I thought a lot about this question, and I'm just going to go ahead and just read it out to you right now, because I'm kind of moving into a new territory a little bit, but hopefully it goes well. In recent history, social justice has been at the heart of a lot of political action. You can look at several important movements, like the Black Lives Matter movement, that references notions of injustice. How do these movements impact change in policymaking?
It demonstrates that what we do in government and what we do in activism is fundamentally a moral undertaking. That our role is to advance notions of justice and fairness and good in the world. I'm deeply influenced by Abraham Maslow's theory of self-actualization. So Abraham Maslow holds that we all have a hierarchy of needs. And the highest need that we have is self-actualization, self-fulfillment. But in order to fulfill ourselves, in order to become the best version of ourselves, we all need access to our most basic needs. Not only water, shelter, and food, but also access to housing, education, transportation, fresh food. We all have employment. We all have these fundamental needs. And so for me, social justice means creating a society, providing people with essential public goods that enable them to become the highest version of themselves, to fulfill their God-given talent and potential in the world. That's what social justice means to me.
Congressman, thank you so much for sharing that. Mariella, final question for you. What is one thing that you learned from today's conversation that you thought was especially meaningful to you?
There were so many things, but one thing that I learned was that to accomplish any goals in life, you always want to push yourself, and that you want to stay true to yourself, because no matter what, if the truth's out there, that's great, and that there's always hope for people anywhere, everywhere. And I think Congressman Torres is a great example of all those things.
And Congressman Torres, do you have any final words for Mariella and all Burroughs students as we conclude this interview?
Mariella, you're one of the most impressive students I've ever met. So you should know that the sky's the limit for you, and there's no limit to how far you can go in life. I feel like I'm seeing a congressperson in the making. My only ask is just don't run against me.
Okay.
Oh my goodness, that's amazing. Congressman, thank you so much. On behalf of the Pharos community, I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for this. We sent you a gift. It should actually be there today. I don't know if you got it yet already. But once again, this is fantastic, and I really appreciate you taking your time out of your busy day to have a conversation with me and Mariella.
It was a gift. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Mariella! How do you feel right now?
Happy, a lot happy.